Well, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has played down the damage of economic sanctions and claimed his country will be stronger in the longer term. Questions remain, though, is Mr. Putin just putting on a brave face, and how much concern is there within the Kremlin about the growing economic cost of his military operation here? Let's talk now to Christopher Steele, a former British intelligence officer who was stationed in Moscow for a number of years. Thank you very much for being with us, Christopher. And you've been watching Russia and watching Putin closer than most. Do you think this moment was always going to come?
Hello, Mark. Thank you for having me on the show. I don't believe it was inevitable we would get to this point. However, I do believe that given the perception that Putin had of the weakness and divisions in the West and the likely Western reaction to such an adventure as this, that is why we've got to this point fundamentally.
Did you ever think that he would go this far in pursuit of his goals?
To be honest, I didn't think he would launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I thought it was highly likely that he would launch an operation to take Lugansk and Donetsk oblasts and possibly reincorporate them into Russia. But clearly, logistically and economically and in terms of manpower, an operation on this scale is really beyond Russia, and he's overreached this time, in my opinion.
Do you think he's miscalculated? Do you miscalculated militarily in terms of the Ukrainian resistance, and miscalculated in terms of the West imposing tougher sanctions than maybe he expected?
I think there are several gross miscalculations here by Putin. And one of the problems, I think, is when you run an authoritarian regime like he does, and you don't welcome criticism or debate within the leadership, then you end up with bad advice and hearing the things that you want to hear from your advisors. And I think the obvious things here that have gone badly wrong for the Russians, the performance of their own army is not great by any standards. It wasn't either in Georgia or Chechnya before that, so it shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise to us, but it's certainly not what Putin was expecting. In addition to that, you've got the brave Ukrainian resistance, particularly President Zelensky, who Putin didn't take seriously. He's had a bite back there. And then you've got, as you say, the degree to which Western governments have reacted this time, overdue in my opinion, but nevertheless strongly, and in a united way, which has come as a surprise, I'm sure, to Mr. Putin and his advisors.
What do you make of what Boris Johnson has been saying to Sky News this evening, that there may be an issue here where he's paving the way for the use of chemical weapons? Do you think he would do that?
I certainly think if you look at what's happened in Syria and you look at what's happened in Chechnya, and of course what happened on our own streets in Salisbury, I wouldn't rule it out at all. And I think that as the Russian army becomes bogged down and more desperate and clearly not realizing its objectives militarily, you are likely to see more indiscriminate killing and bombardment and possibly the use of a weapon as you describe it.
And what do you think of the way NATO is dealing with this? Do you think that NATO should be, publicly setting out its red lines?
I think NATO has probably set down some of the red lines, although clearly there are war crimes going on in Ukraine as we speak, and those need to be brought to justice in due course in the future. I think that it's very important that militarily Russia fails in this operation, and I think it will only fail if we continue to supply handheld weapons, anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft weapons on a very large scale, and indeed provide economic support to the Ukrainian government and its forces.
Do you think this is a different Vladimir Putin to the leader that you saw a few years ago?
Fundamentally not. I think Putin's family and his background was forged by the siege of Leningrad in the Second World War when 1 million people died. And I don't think that the culture that he comes out of allows him to escape from a kind of fear of encirclement and a zero-sum view of world politics and world affairs. And also, I would argue, a lack of understanding of economy, because economy in the end is what will stop Russia in its tracks and what will probably lead to the fall of this regime sooner rather than later because of the weakness of Russia economically. Russia has an economy which is a tenth the size of just the EU, let alone the US as well, and that will in the end tell, I believe.
What are the chances, do you think, Christopher, of someone in the Kremlin, someone who gets close to Vladimir Putin, taking him out, putting an end to this? Is that at all a possibility?
I certainly think it's a possibility. It's happened in Russia before. Obviously, it happened to Nikita Khrushchev after his failure at the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think it's certainly a possibility. I suspect that Putin is very well protected and paranoid about the people he has physically around him. But I still suspect that we've seen the high watermark of Putinism, and that this overreached adventure and despicable operation in Ukraine will eventually lead to his downfall and that of the regime. And
if it's not someone in the Kremlin, what is the possibility of the people turning against him, that the protests just gather in pace, so much so that it becomes very difficult for Putin to carry on? I assume that, being a kind of dictatorship, that's not going to happen.
I don't think it will be decisive, but I think it will probably be a factor as the economy is squeezed, as sanctions start to bite, which they certainly will, and as people's living standards start to fall. There will be increased protest on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg and other cities, and I think that will play in to probably an elite attempt to remove Putin in due course.
And just finally, 30 seconds or so, how do you see this playing out? Does Putin come out, from this? Does he survive this, do you think?
I think Putin can't be resurrected, as it were, in the international community. I don't see him surviving this in the long term. I think we've gone over a watershed here. And my view is, however, that in the short term, we're going to see probably increased brutality from Russian forces and atrocities in Ukraine, sadly. But in the longer term, the economy and the sanctions and his isolation, both cultural and economic in the world, will tell and will lead to a change of regime in Russia. I certainly hope so.
Christopher, thank you very much indeed.